Rockin' and rollin' on Facebook Live already. Who controls his mic?
I got it.
You got it. That's it. Okay. Hold up your cover toward the camera.
Oh, yeah. Go and buy this. Amazon.
Hey gang, I should mention at the outset of the hour that we are doing a Facebook Live. We're going to do it live, as someone famously once said. I am so excited that Brian Rosenwald, Dr. Brian Rosenwald, is in studio with me to talk about his brand new book. And as I set up an interview that I conducted with him on CNN, I think I'll present him as follows. You need to forget the conventional wisdom as to how Donald Trump won a stunning upset in 2016. You know that story. That story holds that Trump won the presidency by swinging 80,000 voters in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan in this one-off election. But actually, Donald Trump won by harnessing forces and emotions that were 30 years, 3 decades in the making. He owes his success not so much to high school educated white males who traditionally vote Democratic, but they could not stomach Hillary in this one-time election, but instead to the titans of talk radio. For it is they who paved the way for his type of candidacy and his Republican Party. That is the oversimplified version of the thesis of the brand new book by Dr. Rosenwald. It is called Talk Radio's America, How an Industry Took Over a Political Party That Took Over the United States. Brian, you earned your PhD, am I right, by studying talk radio. This was at UVA before you came to Penn.
That's right, Michael. 9 years of research went into this book. Started this thing fall of 2010 in just about this time of year.
Why? Were you a talk radio person when you were young? What was your fascination with the industry?
Well, it was honestly an accident. All of the 20th century historians at UVA were going on leave for the year. They didn't coordinate their leaves. And I needed one more research class in my last year of classes in grad school. And I said to my advisor, what am I going to do? And he said, you want to write a dissertation on the sort of decline of moderates, our old pal Arlen Specter and people like that, what happened to them? And he said, what you're really talking about is polarization. And he said, there's a legal history seminar at the law school, and I want you to look at the legal roots. And he mentioned the fairness doctrine to me. Well, I had never heard of the fairness doctrine, because it went away when I was 4 years old.
Right.
And he said, I'm pretty sure it went away, and the next day we got Rush Limbaugh. And I said, okay. And I did about 2 or 3 weeks of research. And what quickly clicked for me is that no one had really studied this, and that's gold for anyone in the scholarly world. Something that nobody else has written on is such an important kind of thing, and that the story was way more complicated than that kind of, fairness doctrine goes away, Rush comes along, it's a bunch of people with a political agenda pushing this. I realized real quickly that wasn't the case, and I started digging in first to the legal roots and then went broader, and it just morphed along the way a million times.
So many mark the beginning of the Trump rise as June 16, 2015. That was the escalator ride, the dissension, I guess, on the escalator at Trump Tower. But your explanation in the book is that if you want to mark the beginning of Donald Trump's rise, instead you should be looking at August 1, 1988. What happened on that day?
That is the day that Rush Limbaugh takes his path-breaking show national. He'd been in Sacramento for 4 years, and what Rush did, there had been conservative radio before Rush, but it was a bunch of people who wanted to sermonize, who wanted to thump on the desk, and it was like going to church. It wasn't fun. Rush had been a DJ. Rush had been fired a bunch of times in the 70s. He was spinning Elton John records, and he took the shtick he had applied in the 70s to music to talk. And it was fun, it was zany, it was crazy. It was something that the only people who had heard it, that kind of show, were people in a market like Miami that had multiple talk stations and competition. And it really changed the entire pathway for the media.
We're going to get into the impact that it has had on the industry and, more importantly, the impact that it has had on the country. But lest anyone think that the book is a hit job on Rush, you give him his props, at least as an entertainer.
That's right. I mean, I think we need to look at Rush the way that the left looked at Jon Stewart, the way we look at figures like Walter Cronkite, because he recreated something or created something new in the media. This whole idea of infotainment, where people are going to be both entertained and informed simultaneously, owes itself to Rush. He also created a new political force, and it's a unique political force because it's a political force that doesn't necessarily have political motives every day. You know, hosts get up in the morning and say, how can we do the best show today? They don't get up and say, well, what's good for Republicans today? And that has had a unique impact. So Rush deserves all kinds of props. He's a master showman. He provides a unique, interesting understanding of things, and he had this huge impact. And I think a lot of that has been lost because a lot of the people who sort of set the narrative for things don't like Rush.
Brian, a week ago Saturday, you were my guest on CNN, and of course, and by the way, we're going to be talking about the impact of talk radio on the political dynamic of the country for this entire hour, and we'll take phone calls a little bit later. But on television, you got to cover this ground in 5 minutes. So my CNN audience had the very edited version of this. Rush talked about and played audio from our conversation on CNN. And just as you have said now here on SiriusXM, you gave him credit for his entertainment skills and so forth. And he made very, very clear what he said, and I'll play this audio in a little bit, but he said, this sounds like a guy who gets it, meaning you. And he seemed favorably impressed toward the book. Question, do you think once he reads it, he'll appreciate it?
My guess is he wouldn't do a laudatory segment on it for the simple reason, that there are conclusions in this book that I think people in talk radio won't like. And one thing about talk radio is it's a black and white thing. He can't say, well, I think this guy gets it, but I think his conclusions are wrong. He's going to have to say, oh, this is just a hit piece or something like that. But part of the goal of this was to get it, was
right.
To understand what are they trying to do every day, understand how the medium works, as opposed to just imposing some sort of viewpoint on it. And honestly, I think my conclusions have grown harsher towards talk radio in the Donald Trump era than they were, when I finished the dissertation in 2015. I think those conclusions were a little bit more measured because I had to reassess the impact.
Look, this is my livelihood, which is why I'm so keenly interested in the subject matter. I also buy into the premise of the book, and I had a front row seat for everything you described. You made reference to the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine, I think, ended in 1987, and so Rush comes along 1 year later. The point being, and you make this clear in the book, wall-to-wall conservative talk could not have happened up until that time. I cut my teeth in the early 1990s, and even though the Fairness Doctrine didn't exist, my radio station still honored it. There was still this mindset that said if I brought on Democratic candidate X, then I had to have Republican candidate Y because that was the fair thing to do. But people today in 2019 might not realize there was once an absolute obligation to represent all sides.
Yeah, and this is something that I think both sides get wrong. The left says, well, it was all the Fairness Doctrine. And as I talk about in the book, there's a lot of other factors, most especially Rush's talent and the need of AM radio for something different, because let's be honest, music doesn't sound very good on AM.
Right.
And music started going to FM, and with it went the advertising revenue and the audience. So those are more important factors. But on the right, especially hosts themselves, anytime somebody brings up the Fairness Doctrine, they start demagoguing it, and they get it wrong. Fairness Doctrine didn't say, well, if you have a Republican on your show, you absolutely have to bring the Democrat and the Libertarian and the Green Party candidate. What the Fairness Doctrine said is, if you're going to talk about controversial issues on your broadcast station, so it only applied to broadcast radio and television. If we brought it back tomorrow, it wouldn't touch SiriusXM, it wouldn't touch cable news. But what it said was, you have to have overall balance over the course of your broadcasting day. So when Rush is broadcasting under it in Sacramento, it was okay. Rush's show was fine. Why? Because they had a liberal host later in the day. Your early station, kind of followed that model. What happens is, as there's consolidation in the business, as you start to get these huge companies that own syndication arms and syndicate shows like Rush and Hannity, and they also own stations, you get these all conservative stations over the last 20 years. So what do I mean by that? I mean, there's usually a local conservative morning host. There is usually like Glenn Beck, 9 o'clock, Rush at noon, Hannity at 3, maybe Mark Levin or Lars Larson at 6. And then usually they have like paranormal talk overnight or something like
Art
that.
Bell.
Art Bell.
Yeah, I know
type thing.
exactly of what you are speaking, because when I was in syndication, I was looked at as the weak sister among the conservatives. You know, like they would have pointed to me as the liberal, because you're absolutely right that I was surrounded on 100 or so stations, on all of them, by Limbaugh, Beck, Hannity, or a stable of their imitators. And you know what my Sirius XM audience might not appreciate is that they know those bigger names. There are hundreds of imitators out there who are doing that. This is an important point that I want to make clear up front as well. You argue there was no conspiracy to make conservative radio the servant of the GOP. So what then was the goal?
The goal was the almighty dollar. That is what hosts care about. That's what radio executives care about. There were a bunch of decisions made, and some of the people making them were liberals who said, my God, there's an audience for this. You know, Rush goes on, and Rush has this unique talent, and a lot of people in the radio business thought that it was his conservatism that was attracting listeners. And they said, okay, let's try another conservative. Or, you know, and they brought in people, most of whom were not as talented as Rush. They weren't great showmen. They were more pedantic. They could just give you talking points. And then you get into the early 90s, and it starts with a station called KVI in Seattle, where they have a mixed talk format. And one of the guys who worked for Rush's syndication company is in there one day with the general manager and the station, or the program director, and they're smoking cigars, they're having a good time. And the guy from Rush's syndication service, a guy named Lee Vandenhandel, says, you know, why do you have these liberal hosts on? Nobody wants to hear them. And that intrigued the program director and the general manager, and they started doing research. They started talking to callers, they started listening more, and eventually they fire a liberal host and replace him with a conservative, and watch the ratings go to straight up. So they decide to brand themselves for the first time as an all-conservative talk station. Well, KVI... Unprecedented.
Yeah.
There have been other all-conservative or mostly conservative stations, but never branded that way. And then over like a couple of years, they went from 23rd in the market to 1st in the market. Well, what happens is there's a station in San Francisco, KGO. Now they had maybe the longest reign at #1 in the country. It was like 30-something years that they were the #1 station. And there's another station, KSFO, which is rundown, and it's for sale. And the general manager of KGO is a guy named Mickey Luckhoff, and he says to his bosses at what was then Capital Cities and ABC, can we buy this station? Because I don't want someone to build a competitor to us. Well, they buy the station, but then they need something to put on the station. And he calls his old program director, a guy named Jack Swanson, who's up in Seattle. And Jack is a card-carrying Democrat, liberal Democrat. And he says, you know, would this conservative talk thing work here in San Francisco?
San Francisco. Underscored, right.
Right, and Jack says it would. Why? Because you only need 3 to 5% of the audience in a big city station to be successful.
You don't need, you just need loyalty. You don't need volume.
Right. And they say, you know, they turn KSFO into an all-conservative station, and it does really well. Well, that's an ABC station, so all the other ABC affiliates, you know, the program directors say, my God, this is working. And they say, let's try this. And you get the decisions like that over and over again that build this way, you know, this pathway, and it's all about business.
And the reason it works not only is because Rush is a very talented broadcaster, but also because legitimately there was a vacuum at the time. This was pre-Sirius XM. This was pre-cable television. There was no Fox News. There was not a Patriot channel. There were not conservative outlets. And the media really was a liberal place. Like today, when people talk about the liberal media, I take umbrage because the media today is whatever the hell you want it to be. Bloggers are media. Cable stations are media. Sirius XM. But then, you know, it was the era of Jennings and Brokaw and Rather, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and it was unprecedented that there would be this conservative voice like Limbaugh heard so widely. I want to read something from your book. By the way, Talk Radio's America is the book, and Dr. Brian Rosenwald is the author. You write this: did ideology spawn Limbaugh's massive popularity, or was it his talent? No doubt ideology was critical in capturing the hearts and ears of alienated conservatives, yet there is good reason to believe that the greater part of Limbaugh's stunning sudden success rested on his radio abilities. Limbaugh possessed all the attributes radio executives look for in an ideal host. Outspoken and opinionated, he informed, entertained, inspired, and engaged. He grabbed listeners and held them riveted in their cars, idling in their driveways, so that they wouldn't miss a moment. Did Rush, this is my question to you, did he therefore shape listener opinions, or was he simply giving them voice?
He was simply giving them voice on bedrock principles. His listeners, this is another misnomer out there, on the left, where they say, oh my God, these people just lead their audiences around like marionettes. And that's not true. These hosts are taking a shared set of principles that they have with their audience, a shared set of values. Rush grows up in middle America, and he's applying the values that he got at his dinner table every night to the issues. So he shares those values with his audience, but what he does is he can apply those. He can say, folks, I'm with you. We have these values. And he can apply it to issues that his audience might not have heard of, or candidates that his audience might not have heard of. He can say, there's this bill in a House committee, and this bill threatens our values. And his audience is going to trust him. They build that bond over 30 years. And so he is applying it. He's informing them in a select way, from a perspective on issues that they might not otherwise know about. But to say, well, Rush just changes people's values, yes, it's happened. The Andrew Breitbart, the late Andrew Breitbart, writes about how Rush kind of led to his transformation. But it's happening with a fraction of the audience.
Brian, we should also point out that this transformation happens at a time when AM radio is in trouble. And so it's talk that provides a lifeline to AM radio. And as you point out, the number of talk stations triples between 1989 and 1994. So this became the life preserver for terrestrial radio.
Yeah, as most people in the radio business, executives will tell you, they're not the most creative of people. The first question their boss is going to ask them when they try a format is, where is this working?
Right.
Because you're not going to get fired for trying the hot in thing.
Right.
But if you try something new, you might get fired if it fails. So as this starts to work, people say, well, I better try this. It's working somewhere else. And so over the course of the 80s, early 90s, talk emerges as the savior of AM radio. There are a lot of people I interviewed for this book who said to me, Rush Limbaugh saved AM radio.
So when I brought you on at the outset, I promised my audience that they were going to hear the most cogent explanation as to how Donald Trump was elected that they will find in any book. And we haven't said much about him thus far, but here's what I would offer. So the time period that we're talking about, Limbaugh coming on the national syndication stage is August 1, 1988. This is the same cycle where one Donald J. Trump makes his maiden voyage to New Hampshire. I think that's the visit where he went to Yoakum's restaurant and spoke to a Republican group and had a standing room only crowd. And it began a process where every 4 years, from 88 to 2016, he would, quote unquote, threaten to run for president of the United States. The table wasn't set for him in 1988, but by 2016, it was. How come?
Well, one of my favorite anecdotes in the book, and I picked this up, I think, from John Meacham's biography of George Bush, is Donald Trump floats himself as a vice presidential possibility in 1988, and it just baffles President Bush. He says, well, this guy, why would I consider this? But what happens is, every day people are listening to hours of talk radio, Republicans, base voters, people who show up in primaries. And every day for 30 years, those hosts are often not satisfied with Republicans. They say, oh, these Bushes, why are they compromising? Why are we adding a prescription drug benefit to Medicare? Why are they not cutting spending more harshly? And over time, the hosts, there's a pragmatism to hosts in the early 90s. I talk in the book about Rush talking about then liberal Mitt Romney in 1994, running to the left on some issues of Ted Kennedy, and begging his audience, saying, don't not vote for Romney because he's not far enough right. He's still a step in the right direction. But over time that erodes for business reasons, competition, sensing where their audience is, sensing the frustration once they get unified Republican government, and it doesn't deliver on all those promises. And they've been saying over and over again, these Republicans, they're not delivering. If they would just fight for you, they would just fight for those values you care about so much and take it to those snide, obnoxious, condescending, mean-spirited people on the left, we would actually get America back. We would save those values that are so important to us. And this happens year after year after year. And they spend all that time running down the liberal media, what Rush calls the drive-by media, as though somebody's shooting truth and fairness. And you do that for decades, and then you get to Donald Trump, 2016. Well, what does Donald Trump sound like? He sounds like a conservative host. And there was something that a lot of us missed in the primary, because they said, well, wait a second, this Trump guy, he's not a conservative. He was pro-choice, he was pro-gun control at one point. He's thrice married. They said, this guy's not going to appeal to conservative evangelicals, but his style did.
Right. And by 2016, they're now ready to vote for somebody who sounds like their favorite talk radio host.
Yeah, they finally say, they hear him, they say, hallelujah, someone is finally fighting for us. And that is the same reaction that Rush got in his early years on the air. People said, thank God we have a voice, and they said it again with Trump.
Here's another important piece of this. I don't want to give away the whole book. I mean, I'm totally into it. I took copious notes as I read it. You allowed me to read an advance of it, and I was proud to give you a blurb for the back jacket. But this is a really important part of it that you cover, and it's Charlie Sykes to whom you turn for some guidance and explanation. By 2016, Donald Trump has become this bigger-than-life figure ready to take advantage of the road that's been paved for him by talk radio. And the quote-unquote, mainstream media can't do anything to bring him down. Why? In large part because the mainstream media were so wounded by attacks that came from talk radio. Here's the way you write it in the book. It's in a quote from Charlie Sykes. Finally, and most importantly, by 2016, talk radio had spent close to 30 years destroying the credibility of mainstream media, at least as far as listeners were concerned. Throughout the campaign, journalists would reveal Trump's objectionable and hypocritical activities, after which pundits and officials would confidently proclaim the death of his candidacy. In each case, he took no more than a brief hit in the polls and then bounced back off the mat, stunning commentators. He was able to dodge disasters that would have ended virtually any other candidacy and his own in the earlier era, in part because his fans simply did not believe what reporters discovered about him. As one Trump backer, Lynette Hardaway, told the New York Times, all those provocative words that the media had been trying to use on him for the past 9 months, I believe that they were all lies. Quote, speaking of his talk radio comrades, Sykes admitted, we bear some responsibility because we beat on the mainstream media for so long, and now they are no longer a credible source. I mean, Charlie really explains it, right? All the lambasting of the mainstream media that his audience had heard for 3 decades, now when it's the New York Times or the Washington Post doing negative pieces on Limbaugh, his audience is immune to that.
Yeah, I like to use a pro wrestling analogy, because a lot of young men like me watch pro wrestling
Sure,
in the 80s.
me too.
So what this is the way the conservative talk radio audience sees politics is you've got your good guy, you've got your bad guy. Well, the mainstream media is the bad guy's manager who's waiting out there on the outside to take that chair and slam the good guy over the head. And that's how they view the mainstream media. They see Trump as this hero who's out there trying to save them, and they see the media trying to destroy him.
Yes, but you're leaving out one important aspect, and that is, I hate to break it to you, pro wrestling is fake.
That's right.
It's fake.
Right.
So, how much of this is fake?
It is designed to produce the best show, which means that nuance doesn't sound great. And this was a point Rush disagreed with what we said on CNN, where he said, my show has more nuance in this. But
Right.
I wasn't talking about policy detail. What I'm talking about is there is a black and white soap opera, pro wrestling kind of way, good versus bad. And that is the ethos of talk radio. It is boring to get up there and explain what media bias actually is. It takes 30 seconds, a minute. as opposed to just saying those awful mainstream media reporters who are destroying this country.
You argue, and we'll come back and we'll address this in a moment, that talk, while encouraging participation, we can thank talk radio for inciting participation in areas where it otherwise would not have been the case, but it ensured dominance by a very small number. And I want to talk about that. Here's what we're going to do. We'll say so long to our Facebook Live friends, encourage them to buy the book, Talk Radio's America. We'll come back on POTUS and include telephone calls at the usual number, 855-486-1776. You've now heard the thesis in expanded form from Dr. Brian Rosenwald. What do you make of his assessment as to the relationship between the changes in the talk radio industry that I've borne witness to in the last 30 years and the election of Donald Trump in 2016? Call me now at 855-486-1776. All right, still hot on Facebook Live.
Book up one more time.
Of course we can. There is. Wait, I'll do better. I'll read my blurb to the Facebook Live crowd, and then we'll say so long. Rosenwald proves that the outcome of the 2016 election was 3 decades in the making, made possible by the emergence of a candidate perfectly suited to capitalize on an environment created by the titans of talk radio. This is the book that provides proper context for the greatest election upset in modern American history. Smerconish at SiriusXM and CNN. Thank you, Facebook Live. Keep your comments coming and share this with a friend. It's a great book.